Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, and I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. As society tries to identify and guard against cybersecurity risks, it's clear that underinvestment in security is creating system-wide failures. Here to discuss this topic are Annie Fixler. She is the Deputy Director and Research Fellow at the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy in Washington, D.C. And also we have Chris Nolan. He is the Qualitative Research Lead at Intangic.com. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks so much for having us.
First, maybe start with you, Annie. Can you describe the nature of this cyber security threat that we have these days?
Sure. I would say that the threat is getting bigger as we become increasingly dependent on digital devices, automated systems. The attack surface, as we say, is just getting bigger. And the problem is we are dependent on these systems, but not securing them at the same time.
Yeah, so what can you give us some examples of cybersecurity attacks that are most concerning to you?
Sure. I think for the everyday person, the most concerning attack is ransomware. Because it doesn't matter how big or how small you are, how large of a business you have, how small of a business, your systems are important to you. Your data is important to you, and hackers understand that. And so they are locking up your systems, they're attacking your systems and encrypting the data such that you can't use it. And they are demanding payment to give you your data back. And it used to be that most companies would assume, I don't have any sensitive information, I don't have classified information, I don't have trade secrets. No one will bother attacking me, but hackers understand that your data is important to you. And so they are exploiting that and attacking companies, individuals across the spectrum, across the country. So it is a growing and concerning problem.
Chris, from your perspective, are you aware of where Canada kind of fits into this nexus of security threats?
Tony, thank you. The nature of the threat is global. It's universal. So, for example, a Canadian company is going to face challenges very similar to a European company or a company in the United States. Companies within sectors sometimes see threats that are similar to one another, but then there are certain global threats that any company faces. As Annie outlined, the real game changer is the fact that companies across the board, whether you're a hospitality company, what you would consider to be maybe a traditional industrial company, a consumer goods company, they've all digitized operations in such a way that has meant, their margins are larger, they're more efficient often if that technology is well managed, but the threat surface has grown. And that is in fact universal. So the same could be said of a Canadian, sort of banking company that could be said of an American banking company in terms of the sort of threats that they face on a day in, day out basis because of this sort of expanding threat surface that's a byproduct of this sort of digital transformation.
Chris, has it kind of enhanced? I know there's a lot of cloud-based computing that has gone on in the last few years. Is that part of the issue, or is it something other than that?
That's a big part of it, Tony. Satya Nadella, around the time of the pandemic in early 2020, was quoted as saying, Microsoft, that is really at sort of the intersection of this digital transformation process, observed 3 years of digital transformation in about 3 months as companies across the board, large, medium, and small, raced to figure out how to operate remotely, right? And all of the sort of operational implications of doing that. And so what we've seen is, a trend that maybe 10 or 15 years in duration has accelerated significantly in the past 3 years.
And part of that is COVID. Is that fair to say?
Part of that is COVID, but all of these trends certainly were set in stone long before COVID. Cloud computing, as you highlighted, is a big part of that, and the attractiveness of that to a company is, the opportunity to gain market share faster, to operate more efficiently, to grow your profit, to grow your margin faster than you otherwise could without digital technology. It's just part and parcel as we experience day to day. It's now part and parcel of the way that we live our lives.
Well, an interesting topic. We're going to continue to delve into it with our two guests. Cyber risk, cybersecurity, cybercrime, all of these terms are now very well known. Stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages. Tony Clement here, talking about cybersecurity with Chris Nolan. He is of the Qualitative Research lead at Intangic.com, and Annie Fixler at the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation. There's a lot more to your title, Annie, than that, but for the purposes of time management, we'll just leave it at that for now. Annie, you and Chris have described in a paper that I read about some of the issues that are driving force for this cyber insecurity, I guess is the way to put it, including underinvestment. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. I mean, across the board, what we're seeing is that companies are digitizing, automating. So it takes humans out of the loop, this expression. So you no longer have a person controlling a switch, you have a computer controlling a switch. And that's sort of broadly across the board. The challenge is that those systems, because they are often internet connected, because at the end of the day, there is a remote access for a human to monitor things, they are vulnerable to attack. And so we're not protecting those systems and creating resiliency in those systems. We are just digitizing, automating, and removing humans who can make maybe perhaps smarter decisions than computers sometimes, who are just going to keep operating as directed and take any next direction. So, if a hacker gives them a bad direction, a computer doesn't know good or bad. I just know I'm supposed to do what I'm directed to do. So that's sort of the nature of why automation gets challenging from a cybersecurity perspective.
Chris, from your perspective, I'd like you to comment on this too, and maybe even more specifically, is 5G kind of also a threat in terms of its sophistication? We're rolling out 5G in Western countries now. Is that going to be problematic in some way?
Tony, I think 5G is just part and parcel of the larger digital transformation process. I think it's emblematic of just the direction we're heading in terms of faster, greater, deeper connectivity in our own lives and how companies operate, as Annie alluded to. What we see, honestly, is with the private sector, and this is part of the impetus, I think, for writing the paper.
Right.
Unlike what you see with product and product safety, universal standards, oversight and regulation of how products are rolled out and assessed, that doesn't exist in the world of information security. And therein lies a problem in terms of how that technology is managed and the standards that we expect of companies that hold our data, that deliver services that are largely dependent on digital technology.
Now, you've in this paper, you talk about a digital risk rating system. Can you walk our audience a little bit through that?
So what Intangic does that's a bit unique in this realm is we look at a company from two perspectives primarily. One is what we can see entirely externally with their security and how well or poorly they seem to be managing their security. And two, what impact that is having on their operations that we can see, again, externally through a certain number of financial factors. And we combine the two that gives us greater insight into how well or poorly that company is operating, and thus how likely or unlikely a security event is to happen. And from our perspective, as an insurer, as an underwriter of risk, what sort of financial losses might be associated with that sort of an event, and getting comfortable with that. And so our ratings underpin basically what you would consider from an insurance perspective to be risk selection. Who's doing good, who's doing poorly, but more importantly, how likely or unlikely is an event to happen in the future, and what cost is associated with that event.
Annie, from your perspective, are companies kind of getting the message? I know you wrote this paper, and obviously you feel strongly that this is important for companies to deal with this. Are they starting to get the message on this?
I think so. The challenge for companies is they're often not sure what to do with, they understand that there's a risk, but what kinds of steps can I take to protect myself? What is the most efficient, I could spend sort of an untold amount of money on cybersecurity. What's the most efficient and effective way to secure my company is often the challenge. So that can lead to paralysis. If you don't know where to most efficiently spend the money, you might choose not to spend the money for feeling like it doesn't matter how much I spend, I'm not going to be secure. They're going to get into my system. So that can be a problem when there are simple things like multi-factor authentication, stronger passwords that eliminate some of the most basic level risks.
Chris, just wondering about blockchain, a lot of promise there because of enhanced security in a lot of ways, but a lot that perhaps the public doesn't understand about blockchain. What are your thoughts about where that fits into the puzzle of this?
Tony, I would say certainly a great deal of promise going back about 5 to 7 years, but from, call it an enterprise security perspective and how blockchain can meaningfully improve an organization's security posture, I think a lot remains to be seen in terms of the commercial application of blockchain across many different realms and sectors before we can say that blockchain is truly a game changer. I think that's still premature.
Okay, so we're waiting with bated breath on that, but not the immediate way to slay the dragon on this. Annie, do companies need to disclose breaches better? Is that part of what you're arguing?
Yeah, I would say better is maybe perhaps even an understatement. At this point, very rarely are companies required to disclose that they've been breached. If there is a leak of personally identifiable information, PII, companies are often required in the United States at a state level, and I believe also in Canada, similarly required to disclose that they've been breached. But if there's been an attack and no PII is affected, a company may not be required to tell anyone they've had an attack. And that distorts our understanding of how the scale of the problem, because if we don't know all of the attacks, we may not know how big of a problem we're dealing with, so we may not be appropriately allocating resources to solving the problem.
Chris, what's your perspective on this?
Annie and I and Intangic and the FTD teams have looked at this very closely. And one of the things that we put forward in the paper is, as Annie said, because there is a lack of disclosure, what we're left with is really about 10% of the overall picture. So we know from certain companies like Mandiant that a fraction of breaches that actually happen are even detected by a company, let alone disclosed. And so that leaves us with a very limited view on what's actually happening in terms of these sorts of breaches that we occasionally hear about in the media. It's a small sliver of the overall activity, which then, as Annie had pointed out, makes it very difficult from a data perspective to determine what the best solutions are, and even really, first and foremost, how large the problem is, which is partly what we were trying to articulate in that paper.
Right. So I guess this brings us to the topic of the role of government in all of this as, I guess, a rule maker ultimately on this. Annie, any thoughts on the role of government to increase cybersecurity? Absolutely.
I mean, there's a number of different places the government has a role. I would say specifically on the question of incident reporting, there's a role for government, and in the United States, Congress has been looking at what can it require, particularly critical infrastructure operators, what can it require them to disclose? So there's a lot of discussion around incident reporting. How quickly should companies let the government know that there's been a breach? How can that inform government policy? How can it better allocate resources? Just again, a better understanding of the problem allows us to have better solutions to that problem.
Yeah, Chris, do you agree with that analysis?
Absolutely. One of the ideas that we put forward in our paper was to update disclosure requirements in a way that reflects risk and reflects where the private sector is actually generating value, and that's from digital assets, right? If you think about the landmark sort of accounting reform that the United States undertook in the form of Sarbanes-Oxley, that was a reflection that our accounting standards were vastly out of date. And if you fast forward 20 odd years today, the disclosure requirements that are currently in place are not reflective of where the value is actually being created by companies, and therein lies the problem, because we're then not addressing disclosure around where the risk lies as well.
Is there more that government should do other than enforcing disclosure, or is that where your head is at right now?
Annie?
Sure. So there's a number of things. I would say disclosure is one piece of it. Better standards and requirements is another piece. For regulated industries, the government can say you are regulated on a number of different pieces, environmental or other quality control. Cyber security is one of those things we're going to regulate. So there is a space for government, I would say, in close collaboration with with those industries, because the last thing you want is just sort of mandates from government, when those mandates could actually make the situation worse if the interlocutors don't sort of understand the scale of the problem and how it's implemented on the ground.
We're going to take another brief break. We'll be right back with our guests. Stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here talking about cybersecurity, cyber attacks with our guest, Chris Nolan. He is the Qualitative Research Lead at Intangic, and Annie Fixler, who is from the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation in Washington, D.C. Gonna throw this at you. Last week in Canada, timing was very interesting. The Global Affairs Department of the Canadian government had a cyber attack right around the time that our Global Affairs Minister, similar to your Secretary of State, was in Kiev talking about how important it was to support Ukraine in this time of geopolitical risk. And then lo and behold, there was a cyber attack attacking her department. You talked about ransomware earlier, Annie, but clearly a lot of these non-state actors can be attached to state goals, or either indirectly or in fact directly. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, the challenge, one of the challenges, let's say, of cyberspace for government response is that, at least, from the United States and Canada's perspective, it's all tied to, I punish the actor who's responsible for the attack. If I don't know who was responsible, or if it's mushy, and it's particularly mushy in cyberspace, it gets challenging. So was it a state actor? Was it a hacktivist who is operating because they think they know what the state wants? Is it actually a government directed but independent hacker? Making that distinction, making the attribution of the attack is challenging. So that makes our responses much more difficult. Yes,
definitely. Chris, what are your thoughts on it?
The nation-state threat, certainly coupled with more sophisticated criminal groups, that you see involved in many of the ransomware attacks that have been disclosed in recent years, is incredibly formidable. And as Annie said, attribution is difficult. The other complicating factor for companies, this is as true for Canadian companies as it is American companies, is often getting caught in the crossfire. Right. We saw this most prominently with NotPetya, which was the large malware attack that occurred about 5 years ago that embroiled companies like Maersk and led to hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. These sorts of threats exist on a daily basis for companies. Sometimes they are the direct target. Sometimes they are, as I said, caught in the crossfire. But the threats are formidable, which really emphasizes the need to have better standards and more transparency and disclosure around how risks are being managed on a day-to-day basis. So we have a sense of the sort of resilience levels of an organization to these sorts of threats.
I think that's a great point. And in a sense, in order for government to react to non-state state actors with their cyber attacks, they've got to know that the attack actually took place. Is that would you agree with that, Annie?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, knowing the attack is the first step. And without knowing it, you can't punish those responsible. And then figuring out, a combination of analyzing the data to try to figure out what, who's responsible for the malware, and combining it with intelligence information to understand who's responsible. That at the moment takes a while, which means that we don't respond immediately when there's an attack, which then hampers maybe perhaps the cost that we're able to impose on the attacker, and has sort of it tells the rest of the world you can sort of get away with some of this, which is, I think, why you'll see particularly criminal and non-peer states engage in cyber attacks, because they can get away with it for a while before we're able to attribute and then respond.
Okay, we got less than 30 seconds left, guys. Chris, are you optimistic about the future when we're talking about dealing with cybersecurity threats?
I think if we can find solutions that draw the best ideas and capabilities from public and private sector, the future looks better than today.
And Annie, how about yourself?
The threat is getting bigger, but I think people are finally understanding we need to respond. So across the board, companies and government understand that the status quo is unacceptable. So that makes me hopeful.
Well, on that hopeful note, I always like to try to end on a hopeful note. Thank you to our guests for appearing today. Very interesting topic.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tony.
Very interesting discussion there from our expert guests on cybersecurity and cyber threats. Obviously, a lot's happening, a lot is evolving. State threats, non-state threats, ransomware, malware, it's all there. So we're going to continue to cover this topic. You can bet on that. Thanks for watching.